Charlie, how are you?
I'm good, mate. How are you?
Good. Let me just get, there we go. Great, great. Good to see you online on video.
Yeah, likewise. I really didn't know that you were from Perth. I would have thought to maybe do it in person, but there you go.
All right, no worries, no worries. Well, I think in the times that we're living in, the move
Yeah,
into the digital space and all the online meetings is where we're at the moment.
yeah, absolutely. So, listen, I'm going to press record if you're happy with that. But I'll say straight up if there's anything that you and I want to come back and edit or take out. Because I really just want an authentic conversation. It's just I feel that it's likely to produce some good content, and it would be a waste not to capture that. So
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Like that was kind of my thinking as well, because we've got a lot of work to do on the generating content. But before we start, I just want to
yeah,
establish, like, how long, what's your expectation of how long we'll go for? Like,
it probably come down to how long you're available to. I mean, I've put in my calendar just an hour. I
cool.
think I could, if it's a really good convo, I'd split the video into topics, because I understand people's ability for long range content's tough, but we've got a lot to talk about. So
Cool.
I'm happy to go deep. Is that cool with you?
Yeah, all good. And you have like the ability to record in Zoom. You have that
Yeah,
functionality. Cool. And how's the audio coming through from my end to you?
great, perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to test a few things as well. Just see if this comes up on your screen.
Yep, it's back to front though.
It's back to front. Great. Okay, cool. I just want to change that real quick.
That's odd. I've never seen that happen before. There we go.
Okay,
Right.
interesting. Yeah, that's backwards for me. It's just this software that I use for this type of stuff. It's okay.
Cool.
That's okay. And just okay. So, which hand am I waving right now to you? What hand does
Right.
this look like? Right.
Right.
Okay. Interesting. That's my left hand. Okay.
Yeah, no, I
Cool.
can see that it would be your left hand if I.
Okay, but it's on your right hand side. Yeah, that's fine.
Right. Yeah.
Just wanted to check that and. Cool. Okay.
Awesome. So I have just today started a vlog, um, really with the same theme as the tweet the other day, which is let's explore if there's a party worth voting for, and what people want if it is outside the two major parties. Um, so I think let's assume people that are maybe watching, hopefully, have never heard of Flux. Would you probably best to start with what's happened to get you to be the director of Flux, and then we can probably get you to go into what Flux is.
Sure thing. Okay, so for anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Daithí, and I serve as the Director of Flux, the political movement based in Australia that really is all about empowering people and connecting people into decision making in Parliament, and really, upgrading democracy is one of our taglines. What brought me on this journey ultimately was, like a lot of people, I'd been thinking about, when you look at politics, I'd always had an interest in it, but had a real disdain for just the way that people and groups seem to carry on in there. And there was just this real element of all politicians are bad, they're all out for themselves. And I will admit, I kind of subscribed to that mentality for most of my youth. But then when I got into my mid-20s, I started seeing how it was possible for people to start getting involved in politics, because ultimately politics and politicians and political parties are made up of people. And if you go out and you make the connections with the people, you can start to see how political parties work, how politics works, and so forth. And I encountered a lot of people in the political space, just got to know a little bit about how political parties worked, both in Ireland, where I'm from, and in Australia when I moved here in 2010. And I had a really interesting time coming to understand the different dynamics between different parties and kind of the culture and the way different groups came together around ideology. But I always saw all of them running into the same problem, that essentially they were always just trying to, beat the other person's ideology, or kind of like prove the other person wrong, or just win and force their way to get control and win the argument and win the debate, win the election. And but things never seem to actually get better. Things just seem to either switch back and forth for a couple of years, but we weren't making any real progress. And then I started, like a lot of people, again, when you start thinking about this more and more, you go, what was missing from all of this? And it was the participation of people, just not just using the term regular people, but all people in society, because we have, there's no such thing as a regular person. Yeah. Everyone is different and an individual, but let's call it the aggregate population. There was no real way that we were getting the aggregate of the population's input into decision making, except on a, every 4 years, 3, 4, 5 years at election time. And then I saw the Swiss model of direct democracy and how that worked, where all Swiss citizens are asked what they think on pretty much every issue that comes before Parliament, and then they let politicians deal with the administrative function of getting Parliament to work and getting laws passed. Then all of that was just part of the journey. But I think it was around 2012, 2013, I had a meeting with the senator in Ireland about trying to figure out, was there any appetite among politicians for really getting to know what their constituents were thinking. I was working in the tech area at the time, and I just saw that there was a real opportunity for us to use technology to bridge the gap between our elected representatives and people. And that just kind of brought the thinking on a little bit more, but it wasn't something that I felt able or equipped to act upon or build upon. And then a few years later, I stumbled across Flux, and I saw that in 2015, this organization had been set up with very similar ideas on how we should be engaging people into the political process. But they seemed to have done like really good thinking on what would the solution look like? How would we actually do this? So I just rocked up to a meeting and started talking to the people who were there. This was in the lead up to they first came on my radar in 2015, 2016, but it wasn't until the lead up to the WA election in 2017. So around November 2016, I had some conversations with these people, and we got together and we ran a campaign in WA. And because I had been interested in politics for so long, I had a fair bit of experience having worked on some campaigns in the past. I just took the WA campaign, tried to put a bit of structure to it and really get us in the mix. And we came close, but we didn't make it. We didn't get elected at that particular time. We had a very short campaign. But then after that campaign, I saw the potential of how close we were, but how much work we still had to do. And I spoke with all the people who were involved in the organization and the founders, Max and Nathan, about what I thought for the organization, where we could go and so forth. And Max and Nathan asked me to come on board as a director of the organization. And just director is just really just a placeholder term for someone who's listed on registered documents that hold the hold the entity together. But my real role in the organization is around campaigns and trying to get Flux as a philosophy and as an idea injected into the public consciousness around predominantly around the time of election campaigns. But very shortly, and I'll speak about it in a while, we'll be releasing our technology to the general public, and we'll be really stepping up our efforts in trying to make this idea of connecting people to decision making in Parliament, to make that tangible, to put the technology in people's hands, get it tested, do some iterations, and really try and move ourselves along in this journey, this collective journey that we're all in, that we call democracy.
It's hard because I want you to explain what Flux is, but you sort of have given me such a perfect segue to a question, which I think I'm just going to say it because it works. When I was looking, let's say, because we share almost identical ideals and everything that we're frustrated by, and there's not a lot, I think, of disparity between us in pretty much everything you've said. Let's say I found a party that I was willing to run with as a candidate. I would only consider doing that if that party would enable me to have the mechanism like your technology has, where I'd be able to consistently seek the views of my constituents. Is there a reason why, instead of just being a technology platform, that you felt it was important to be that political party, or I mean, obviously you've got a legacy behind you as well, but I'm talking in terms of a future direction, that instead of the tech platform, it's also the political party?
Yes. So with all new ideas, if the idea just, an idea is just a seed, and for it to grow into something tangible, you have to plant that seed in the most fertile ground available to you. And for all things related to politics and political awareness, there is no time like elections for really injecting a new idea, a new policy, some new aspiration into the public debate. Now, because our idea as well sits in the realm of trying to solve issues in politics, there's a number of ways that we could approach trying to bring this idea to the fore. And one would be to take a completely agnostic, standoffish approach and say, we're going to build some technology, and if you want to use it, come and use it. Mm-hmm. And that would be a valid approach. And there are some groups who are taking that approach, just really trying to develop platforms that anyone can use and get involved with. And that's great to a point where, the people who are aware of it may find themselves using that platform, and then may build upon it and go forward with it. But for us to really accelerate the process, because politics in Australia and in most countries is very squarely in the realm of political parties, parliament, elections, and so forth. If you want to make change in that space, it's you get so much more leverage for your efforts by being a registered political party. It really gets you it gets you a seat at the table at election time, when there will be eyeballs brought to your idea, just by the very fact that you're participating in elections and giving people another option to think about, instead of just having to choose from the standard menu available.
Yeah.
So it really is just about us being pragmatic in trying to use whatever opportunity we can to bring our idea to people and make it happen. And we may find in the future that that other groups will come along who just provide the technology to other parts. And it's all of these sorts of ideas that we just want to promote. We think that there's so much opportunity for us to optimize the connection between people and Parliament by using platforms like this. So this is just the way that we're choosing to do it. There's loads of different approaches that groups can take, and we'll just see we'll just see as time goes on what works and what doesn't work.
And I really like that, because I made a video just earlier today as sort of, I guess, an intro into what I'm trying to achieve with this vlog. And, you know, and I made the point that a very, very long time ago, the Australian parliament or parliamentary system was actually quite innovative. Preferential voting, for example, is quite innovative. It had its day of being known for that, but it's been stagnant, and considering how much we've evolved and innovated and reiterated and disrupted every other facet of our lives, that that's largely been the reason I've been borderline obsessed, but really captivated with the idea of, we've got incredibly smart people, we've got good people in this country, it's the best country to live in, but we deserve a better system or a better way to make decisions collectively as a country. And why should we just continue to accept dysfunction when great minds can come together and come up with a different way to serve the purpose of collectively making decisions? So I think in that way, Flux for me is an technology platform that you're offering is a no-brainer, because it starts, as you said, the conversation that has been missing, that we shouldn't just have one opportunity to vote one party in for an election cycle. We know that, say, marriage equality vote and the plebiscite, first of all, the cost was phenomenal and ridiculous. Not everyone that voted in Parliament actually listened to the will of their people. There is examples of that both sides, where they ignored the vote of their constituents. And I think, you know, with things like climate change, there's certainly a lot of really important topics that, because there isn't that mechanism where we, the people, get to contribute and voice. And I mean, I guess there is, it's not fair to say there isn't a mechanism, there is, but for the younger generations and for society as it has evolved, the mechanisms that exist aren't being utilized and leveraged. And I think with platforms like what you're bringing with Flux, the fact that it's on an iPhone, it's more engaging, I think that is the natural progression for that kind of relationship that needs to change between those that are enacting or responsible to enact legislation and the people that desire a will or a change. But I guess like the question I have for you, and it immediately came to my mind as you were talking, was if you've got a platform that is secure, so we can go into a bit more about why blockchain and why that's the superior option to do this outcome. If it's a secure platform and it enables representatives to have ongoing conversations with their constituents, you've got quite a lot of power then, because let's say you get mass uptake with a lot of people. There's 7.3 million people aged between 20 and 40 in this country. So let's say a big chunk of them downloaded the app. You've actually then, as Flux, would have a lot of power to be able to say to all parties, well, you can use this app of ours at a cost, obviously, if you abide by a set of rules or values, or if this is the code of conduct that you're not able to use our platform if you break this social contract. And that social contract could very well be the values of which you espouse and you see on your website, because they're not going to be able to compete with you on a tech, right? Or at least it's going to take a long time and a hell of a lot of money. Yeah, that's the first thing that came to my mind. Is that something that you guys would ever think about, or are you just going to stick with what you're doing with the political party structure and then feel out what works?
I would be very surprised if any... So your point about asking political parties, would they be, if they wanted to utilize a technology, a solution like this, under the proviso that they sign up to a set of principles, yeah. No existing political party would go along with that, in my view, because they're defined and built on the ideology that brings their members together. So because just by the very nature of how political parties generally come together, as I said, banded around a shared ideology, the idea that they would abandon that ideology, for something like a more direct democratic type principles would essentially lead to the disintegration of those parties as they exist. So all organizations will do whatever they can to survive. Like businesses and organizations, they do whatever they can to survive. That's their main objective, stay functioning. So I would be very, very surprised if one of those groups that you're referring to would be willing to, to say that they would abandon their ideological principles for the good of listening to the people.
I don't think they will either, but that's the advantage that perhaps some of these smaller micros, and I mean, you guys are, I would put you in that basket. I don't know if that's offensive, but in the smaller alternative to the status quo, you guys firmly sit. But listen, maybe you're right. Maybe none of the others that are propping up all over the place would. But there would be an advantage to those that did against, to use those big parties, I guess, against themselves. And I guess you probably answered the question. You're filling the gap that the majors aren't, because they have no interest in this kind of direct democracy or civil engagement.
We have to remember as well the purpose of elections, and like the role that elections and what, like the incentives that are currently in place, what happens as a result of that. And everything you've described up to now is an example of what happens when political organizations want to win.
Yeah.
And that's one of the issues that we have at the moment. Political parties and political candidates want to win so that their idea can win, so that they can implement their idea because that's their idea and they're there to make their idea win. When the real question is this actually the best idea? Is this what we should be doing? And
I think what you're saying is it's 100%. It's what winning is at the moment is re-election and power. But what it probably should be is optimum policy.
Exactly.
Right?
And that, that's a very difficult aspirational state to aim for. So the one that I kind of bring it back to is the state that we should be looking for at the moment is to enable, and this is an idea that came from Karl Popper, the political philosopher. We should be trying to set up our systems so that we can remove bad legislation as quickly and efficiently as possible before it does any harm. Because, like, let's be honest, we don't know whether an idea is good or bad until we try it.
Yeah.
And so I will never hold it against anyone for saying, I have an idea about how we think we should do it. This is how we should do it, and I'm going to do my best because I really believe this is the best way to do things. I'm going to try and make this happen. I totally understand that, completely rational behavior. But where I take issue is when someone brings that idea, makes it happen through the political apparatus, and then when we discover that it's not working, that we don't try and repeal it, we don't try and change it, and that's a real issue. Like, we need to be able to ensure that if we implement some legislation in Parliament, and then we realize this is actually not good, we need to change that. That's the scientific principle in action, where you form a hypothesis, you do a test, and then you observe the results of the test. And based on those results, you either change your hypothesis or you do some error correction along the way. And with ideological driven political parties and political candidates and a parliament that has essentially now become an ideological battleground as to what legislation can be implemented, you're never going to be guaranteed that you're getting the best legislation put in place and bad legislation removed. And that at the core of it is a real fundamental issue. And it's why I don't think that an awful lot of the, even smaller ideologically driven groups are necessarily setting themselves up for success, because they're playing by the exact same rules against bigger entities who will outmuscle them, out-debate them, outspend them in this battle of ideology, as opposed to us having a real, heart-to-heart, eye-to-eye, mind-to-mind national conversation about how do we establish what is working and what doesn't work. and how do we just make these things much more clearer and explicit and remove the emotion, remove the ideology, and use some of the best thinking, the scientific type thinking that has propelled our society forward at such a rate, bring some of that thinking into our political arenas.
Absolutely, because I think, I mean, so I often will just bring everything back into it's not the private sector, but into capitalist system because it works. And I think that the issue around the way it's structured in terms of the time, so often there isn't enough time, and the pressure for them to implement a strategy, really see if it works and do those amendments before they have to quickly get ready for election cycle, I think is undoubtedly a problem. And then the offset problem is if you extend the term, then we could end up being like, let's imagine we were in America, a much longer time with a really dangerous government in power. So we would have to have mechanisms to be able to help ease that from happening. So that's talking, possibly quite significant structural change. But when you were sort of talking about good policy or bad policy, I think what has never really been, at least if it's been written, it's not been accessible to the masses, is what are the KPIs for each legislation? So when we pass this bill, or I'll try and find an example, emissions trading, the ETS, when it was introduced, what was it trying to achieve? So it was trying to achieve some way to reduce emissions, but we would know there would probably be a list of objectives that we expect it to achieve. And then we would also be really aware of what are the risks. So the risks are negative impacts to the economy. There would have been a ton of different economic risks associated, divestment in Australia, potentially, all sorts of things that they would have been fully aware of that are the risks. The fact that we have no easily accessible way to monitor, or like a dashboard, say, where any policy is at, and also set and agree to a timeline. So for example, with an ETS, for me, it would make more sense if we were going to pass legislation like that, assuming it was a good one, that we would give that piece of legislation a timeline of at least 10 years, when no one, irrelevant of which political party or who's in power in the future, that we've agreed to and passed this to give it a good 10 years, and we're going to track it. And the caveats to amendment would be that it breaks, GDP suddenly falls off, or whatever the risks are. That goes past the zone of acceptability, so to speak. And at that point, it will void the 10-year freeze of being changed, and amendments will be allowed. Like, that's a different way to do things, and it's sort of, in my mind, would break out of this ping pong nonsense that we have. With ideas like that, it's not nuanced, it's not simple enough to put that as to a vote. Like, this is an idea of how we're going to do legislation from this point. What do you say, Australia? Because it's so complicated. So how is Flux potentially going to facilitate that kind of conversation that requires a lot of minds, a lot of debate, and it's complex, right? Like, how can Flux help with that?
Yes, it is complex. We live in a complex world, but complexity isn't necessarily bad. Complex is fine. Complicated is bad.
Yeah.
Just to use a simplistic term. So because of the complexity of all of the world that we live in now, we utilize and leverage technology to try and make some of that easier. And we see this in all aspects of our life, from just how we communicate, how we consume information, how we access information, how we can do so many different various kind of tasks and functions in our lives, but we haven't yet applied it to collective decision making. We've only started, with social media in the last few years, having a collective conversation, and we're already seeing, how, depending on, considering the incentives that were put in place for social media, ultimately, been able to sell advertising to the eyeballs that were participating, we've seen that the incentives have driven a very strange set of outcomes. And what we're experiencing now with social media is the outcome of a very bizarre experiment that nobody really signed up to.
Yeah.
And so we have to be mindful that, because of the chaos, and I use chaos in relation to kind of the chaos theory aspect of how one small little action here can have a much larger effect further down the line or in a different part of the world due to the interconnectedness of our world. We're seeing that introducing technology solutions into this environment isn't necessarily just a panacea that's going to solve all of the problems. We need to ensure that the incentives for whatever solution we put in place are structured correctly. And so bringing that back to what we're trying to do at Flux is, in terms of incentives, and you talked about KPIs previously, there's one basic KPI that everybody can relate to, and it's well-being. If you were to ask someone, if you were to do a survey around the world, like get every person, just ask a very simple question of where would you rate your personal well-being on a scale from 1 to 10? And if we were to take the 10 or the 8 billion people of the world and ask them that question and aggregate all the numbers and overlay it onto a map, it would be very interesting as to what we'd see. Now, there are some groups that would say that they've done this type of analysis and that there might be some correlation between things like, countries that have democratic systems where their citizens are more engaged in political decision making, and they will, as a result, have better outcomes from their parliaments that impact their way of lives, which contribute to their general well-being. And I'm not too sure about how true what I just said actually is, but there's some charts that you can find these on Wikipedia if you just go looking about democracy. And this first chart is essentially, it was a red to green heat map of how democratic countries are.
Right.
And how well their democracies function. And we can see it's very interesting to observe that Australia, very dark green, Canada, very dark green, the Scandinavian countries, dark green, and dark red countries, Saudi Arabia, where we have like an absolute monarchy, is the technical term, and some of the Central African countries. And it'd be very interesting to overlay well-being as a KPI onto a map like this. There's I don't think that GDP serves as a very useful metric for well-being. It's an economic metric, but bringing it back to well-being, it's a concept everyone can relate to, and ultimately that's the KPI that everybody is trying to optimize at every election. Everyone's going, what can I do at this election to try and make my well-being score go as high as possible? And that makes sense. That's what it is we should be trying to do. But
Sorry, do you think that, so well-being for me, like you could have someone who is a negative person, right? And they view their exact same situation, neighbor to neighbor, and they see their well-being as worse off than another. I've always sort of talked about aspiration being sort of the key driver that humanity shares. So on that sort of spectrum, the high end of that spectrum is greed, which we don't like, and largely does dictate a ton of the things that we do. We see it in politics, we see it in business. But the idea of you wanting to give your kids a better opportunities than you had to aspire to grow, it integrates wealth, because I think it unfortunately in our capitalist society, there is a relationship between well-being and wealth, sadly. I mean, I've seen really those on the well-being maps high in certain countries that are very poor. They're very happy being very, like, they're not feeling like they're missing out, and they're content. But I think one of those interesting perhaps the differences here or in a country like Australia. The idea it's a lucky country and that we can all give it a good go, and that prosperity exists for all, or at least there's equality in prosperity. I mean, you can argue with me, but I think that measure is probably a little bit more accurate to what these parties push for, because when we hear about we're reducing the cost of living, or we're reducing the cost of power, and we're giving more jobs, a lot of it is centered around prosperity and aspiration as opposed to well-being. And that's not necessarily the right thing, but mental well-being or physical and health well-being, sadly for me, doesn't feel like what they're pushing for. And perhaps that was your point.
Yeah, I won't get us bogged down in a discussion around semantics or like the definition of words, but I think that you talk about aspiration versus well-being. I think those two things are actually very similar, very well connected, but it's just the interpretations of what aspirational means to certain people, or the interpretation of what well-being means to people like that. That's where you get, that's where the divergence comes. Different people have different ideas about what well-being means. For some people, it's accumulating a lot of money. And for some countries and for some societies, their well-being, their well-being is aligned with aspirations or policies designed to maximize wealth. And certainly there is I think the research on this says that there is a certain amount of money that people aspire to. And once you get to that point, it's only a marginal increase on your well-being or happiness after that. And it's really just about achieving a certain amount of security and well-being in a person's life. I think the research was done in America. I'd need to look up the source of it, but it was something around $80,000 was the number for America, where once a person got to that amount of income or wealth, that anything that came above that was just very marginal. There was no real increase in it. But bringing it back to to well-being, the point that I was making there was that everybody has a way of tangibly relating to their relationship with their society and their society's relationship with political systems. If you don't feel like, granted, on an individual basis, you can have two people who live exactly similar lives in every single way, twins, and one might say their well-being is at a 9, the other might say a 2.
Right.
But again, it's all about aggregating it out over a society. And again, I wouldn't necessarily make the case for using a metric like that where we survey everyone. But what I'm getting at is that if we want to bring people into an ecosystem or into a process that asks them to participate, participatory democracy, which is what Flux is all about, the incentives need to be set up in a way that mean that, that we're optimizing for the right outcomes. And as I said, people go into elections, go into their everyday going, how can I optimize for my well-being and the well-being of the people around me, my family, my community, all the way extending out to the whole country. And some people actually, they optimize their daily activities thinking, how can I increase the well-being of the world, the global community? But it's just ranges on that scale. And so the hypothesis that I put forward is, if we say to people, hey, we'll give you an opportunity to participate in the decision-making which influences the society and country that you live in, my belief on this is that people's well-being over time will increase, because people will start making decisions where they realize these decisions impact me. I need to be making the right decisions. When we make the wrong decisions, we need to correct those decisions.
Right.
And we can measure how are we doing? How do you feel? How are we all doing as a community, as a country? There is a feedback loop built in, just in like the sense check of how are we doing? And at the moment, we have the issue of, when things aren't going well and we go, how are we doing? Not well. What can we do about it? Oh, well, I guess we better rely on hoping that someone that we put into Parliament does the right thing to turn the dial on this. And that disconnection between, people feeling a certain way and their inability to act, like, that's a sociological phenomenon that, there's more research been done into this. And it's another case of people having agency in their lives and been able to make decisions that they believe impact the quality of their lives. Just having that agency increases a person's perception of well-being.
Absolutely.
And that's what we don't have yet.
It increases engagement, though. Like, as you said, agency and engagement, where at the moment there's disempowerment, and largely there's disempowerment through disinformation, through lack of information. The way that our system is engineered isn't one to make it really easily accessible to see, let's say, a heat map of where we're going. That data exists. It's just never been made accessible for the average Australian. I did want to sort of bring us to flux. Like, we haven't really talked about like what flux is. So I'll give my interpretation of it, and then it will be wrong, and then you can explain how it's different. But my interpretation of direct democracy is, as you said, you have an app, you are given a policy question or something to vote on that has a consequence in terms of a decision to make as a collective country. And then your representative would be obliged to act on the will of the people. Is that a fair summary of what it is?
That's a very fair summary. The reason I laughed when you framed the original opening there was that you introduced error correction straight away. That you were going to put forward what you thought it was, and then if it was correct, great, and if it wasn't, I would error correct. And that's one of the principles that's at the heart of what it is we're trying to do. So that was why I was smiling. But that's a very accurate kind of it's a high level encapsulation of what it is we're trying to do. So I'll take us back a little bit more and go, what is it that we're trying to do? Ultimately, what we're trying to do is the project of democracy. Like, we all have this idea about what democracy is, and there's different interpretations of it and different implementations of it around the world. And we're trying to bring an implementation and a version of democracy that we think is the version that is for our time and place right now. Because the democracy, as we know it, the various implementations as they've emerged through time, have been born of that time and place. And this is something that we haven't done in recent times. We don't get me wrong, there's loads of people who've dedicated their lives to thinking very deeply about democracy. But we as a collective, we're very much operating on the software that we installed, either 100 years ago or, back with our friends, the Greeks, which is where the foundation of that word came from. Yeah. Democracy, democratus, people and ruling. And so we're trying to bring the implementation or upgrade the version of democracy to make it more appropriate for our societies as they currently are, and the dynamics that we're currently experiencing, where our societies are so much more different and, as you pointed out, complex than the societies from which we inherited these systems that we previously had. The Greeks, they had their came from the Greeks and then later the Romans, but their version of democracy at the time was very much grounded in a ruling elite, the kind of the rich landowning ruling elite having a say, and they were optimizing for their well-being. And that was their version at the time, when slavery was very much a part of how they operated. They never thought about opening up decision-making beyond that select group of power brokers. And that was born of the time and the place. Go ask the question.
So it's a really interesting one, because it's the same question I have for Flux. With Greece and with those that made the decisions, is it not fair to say that largely that was because a lot of the maths couldn't read? And by virtue of a lack of education, there had to be the class that were literate and had an education, and therefore were able to be their representatives for those that, were, for virtue of whatever their role in society was, unable to participate at the same level. Is that, I mean, 100% there was self-interest in all those things that you mentioned, but it's fair to say part of it was because not everyone can understand and interpret legislation and the depths of complexity that we have in society. Is that a fair point to also raise?
So the Greeks, so going back to the Greek model, you can put forward the argument that that's why the Greeks set up their system in the way that it was, that, oh, we don't trust the lower classes to make decisions. And that's actually, when you think about it, very similar to what we have, in many countries around the world now, where there is the illusion of democracy, where a certain type of like power elite who are able to survive transition of powers and have multiple family dynasties kind of like rule. This kind of like born to rule thing. And there's an argument that would say that, yes, the Greeks were the same. There's also an argument that would say, and there's a book that I have here called, it's called The Foundations of Athenian Democracy, Peasant, Citizen and Slave.
Right, I think.
And in this very book, like the author makes the point that, there's lots to say that the people of the time then did feel that they were sophisticated enough to participate. Obviously, not everyone would be, and in the same way that not everyone today would be in a position to participate in legislation. But again, the Greek model was born of its time, and I'm not going to, there's no point. It's worth studying to figure out what worked, what didn't work. But we don't know exactly what they were talking about on the ground at the time. There was obviously an element of the ruling elite at the time saying, hey, it's in our interest to keep things as much aligned towards our interests as possible, and we'll do the right thing by the underclasses by ensuring that they have food, and as the Romans described it, bread and circuses to keep them entertained, so that the ruling elite could just carry on with what they needed to do to expand the empire. Yeah. But again, systems born of their time and of their circumstances. But this is where our system to date has evolved from, and over time we can see all of these different democratic type or different types of political systems in different countries in the world been implemented, ranging from parliamentary republics in countries in Europe, a parliamentary constitutional monarchy like we have in Australia, through to presidential republics like they have in the US, all different versions and implementations of democracy. But if you examine all of them at the moment, you'll find, again, all born of a time very different to ours.
Right.
And that's that's something that we really need to pay a lot of attention to, because things are very different now, and we'd be foolish to be using the same technology we'd be foolish to be thinking about managing our health in the same way that we thought about doing it 200 years ago.
Right.
Because our understanding has evolved, our technology has evolved, our societies have evolved, and now it's time for us to start doing something similar in the political realm. So the way Flux tries to do this is through a philosophy called issue-based direct democracy. And the title, there's a lot of information in the title. Direct democracy is a concept that is all about giving people a vote for each voter on issues. And so direct democracy is what they've implemented in Switzerland, where citizens get to vote on all the issues from a canton level, local level, all the way through to a federal level. But they've done very well in instilling civic participation as a virtue, and getting people, it's almost a faux pas to be ill-informed on social issues in Switzerland. I've visited a few times. I have some friends there, and like they don't spend all their time talking about politics and arguing about it, but they are informed, and they participate, and they see it as their duty to be informed and make the right decision. And lo and behold, like there's other factors involved in this as well that would make for a whole other conversation. But Switzerland always ranks really high in terms of quality of life, well-being, and all of these sorts of aspirational KPIs that we'd look to hit. So that's interesting. Direct democracy in Switzerland, one person, one vote on all the issues. Now, the issue-based version in our title, issue-based direct democracy, is around bringing it back to an issue basis and not just an ideological basis. We've been very much trapped in thinking that gets us to go to war once every 4 years to defend our ideology or to attack the opposing ideology. And you just have to observe the quality of the rhetoric and the discourse that takes place in the lead up to elections now, where it's all about negative campaigning against your opponent, putting people down, distraction issues, bringing people's personal lives into it, and not really talking about, what's the best legislation? What's the best, like, how do we compare and monitor these policies? So making it about issues is a key part of it. Now, the second kind of key component with Flux is a phenomenon. So I'll just take a step back again, sorry. So at the core, we're all about giving people the ability to have a vote on issues. That's the core idea. Now, that's difficult because, as you pointed out before, who has the time to be informed on every issue that's happening? Who has time to be reading about what's happening in Parliament, the pros and the cons, and really getting into it? There's so many things to try and be aware of. This is where the ability to delegate to someone whose opinion you trust is a really useful mechanism. And this is what liquid democracy is. So an example of that in action would be, I want to participate in voting on issues in Parliament, but what I mostly care about is stuff relating to taxation and the economy, for example. That's what I know about and I like. That's not really my person, but just as an example. But I'm going to say that's what I'm interested in. But when it comes to issues in relation to the environment, for example, I'm not that informed, and but I do know my friend Charlie is really well informed on all things to do with the environment. So if I have a vote on issues relating to the environment, because I'm not going to be able to make a really informed vote, I'll trust my vote to whatever Charlie would do. And so the ability to delegate your voting authority to people, and importantly, to take it back. Like, Charlie, if I delegate my vote for you to make a good decision, if I delegate that power to you, the expectation is you make a good decision. If I find out then that you've been making bad decisions, I'm going to say, hey, no, I'm taking my vote back off you, and I'm going to give it to this other person who I know is doing more research and is better informed. And so that's liquid democracy, and that's a core part of it. And that's really important because that's how you reduce the workload and the burden on people. Because at a very simple level, someone could participate in the system, and participate in issue-based direct democracy and say, I delegate all of my voting authority to vote however the Labour Party would vote on these issues, or however the Greens, you could just very easily mimic what the current system does. But importantly, again, the minute that party or that group is no longer representing your interests, you can say, I no longer delegate my vote to you, I delegate it to someone else over here. Whereas we only get that opportunity once every 3 to 4 years, and not to change on issues, but to talk about, I'm going to replace you because I think you're doing too much harm. Issue-based direct democracy allows us to be much more responsive and to really kind of have our finger more on the pulse as to what's working and what's not working, because at the core, another core principle in our ideas relates to fallibilism. and error correction, in that we have to assume that every idea we hold today is likely going to be replaced by a better idea.
And that's in our interest, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like imagine how badly off we would be if 150 years ago we decided all of the ideas that we have today, these will never be improved on. So anybody who tries to challenge these ideas, we're just going to like punish them because these are the best ideas ever. We'd be like, it's idiocy.
Yeah.
So we assume that whatever decisions we make today, we'll likely want to replace them or change them or do something better at a later point in the future. And that's really the whole phenomenon of error correction. So
can I ask a question about that? So in terms of practicality, so let's assume that, and you're going to have to guide me on this. I see what you've described as like a heat map. So let's say we've passed, ETS is easy, right? So the energy trading scheme, the idea that we'd trade, or carbon credit trading, or whatever anyone, that kind of idea. Let's assume that my girlfriends, for example, have no idea, it's not their place, and they would, I know, happily give me that vote because they trust me and my expertise in that field, no problem. And all of a sudden, there is a certain position that say 80% of the country support, right? So that the heat very much is green, or the color on that is very much green. We take however long it takes to pass legislation. It doesn't happen quickly. There's a lot of work between the ETS is supported and it's enacted, because there's all the nuances and the legislative and the boundaries and all that needs to happen. And then something falls out. I get accused of doing whatever, and a lot of the influences that had yielded a lot of that power and support for that vote start to break away. And before the legislation is passed, it's now back down to, say, a orange color. And let's also take into account, I would imagine, a lot of this will depend on the assumption of a free media. If there is a distorted media influence that are spreading lies and that's not being checked around, and in disinformation, if we're able to swap and take back, how is that going to impact the stability that is required in order to test things, see how they go, and change it if they're not? I mean, is that not a counteraction to the kind of stability that we'd need?
If I find it, okay, yes. So what you're describing there is, what if we set in place some legislation that brings us in this direction?
Yeah.
And then after 3 months, we realize, we're not so sure about that. We think we want to go in this direction.
Yeah.
Okay. And then we're going down this direction. What's to stop us from saying, we need to change in this direction? Great questions, because, and there's no way for me to like really answer that. That would require a model sophisticated enough to understand how crowds are going to act in advance. And so that potential exists. However, I find it more likely that what would happen is we set in force a legislation which brings us in a certain direction. We go, this isn't working too well for us. But rather than doing our traditional, two-party type thinking of it's either this way or that way, we go, okay, this direction isn't working. Let's error correct by 1 or 2 degrees. Like, what is the specific things that aren't working? And making it less about, turning the car around and going in the opposite direction, and make it more about adjusting the speed or getting into a different lane or making taking a different path. I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea that the choice between legislative outcomes is either a direction going in one direction or the extreme opposite direction. I think that if a majority of people were to decide this is the direction we want to go in, and even if their opinion or the perception of the progress of that was changing over time, it would make much more sense for us to alter the course of if 80% of people thought going this direction was right, unless something absolutely drastic has changed, I think it's much more likely we would do incremental, gradual error correction to try and figure out what is it that's not making people satisfied. And until we would ultimately get to some sort of steady state. But the idea of oscillating between two extremes, I think it would be a poor implementation of what it is we're trying to do.
So the reason I think it is plausible that could happen, and the ETS is a great example for that, is we've obviously, with the current media ownership laws that we have and the influence that the extreme right and Rupert Murdoch have specifically in Australia is so significant that even the Labor Party, whose ETS it was, abandoned it midway, like just after it had been passed or through that negotiation period, because of the disinformation campaign that Murdoch ran. And the shadow opposition ran at that same time, but not just that, not just the fact that without and I'm not confident that we have the right laws in place to protect or to ensure flat out lies are going to be stopped in the media. I'm not convinced that we're living in that ideal press or free press scenario. There would need to be changes to that, which are needed anyway. But more, if we have a concentration of support by virtue of this trading system. So let's say, I'll try and think of someone. Okay, Simon Holmes à Court, who I'm obviously a big fan of, and a lot of people are. He has become quite an influencer in anything to do with energy and emissions reduction, and a lot of people listen to what he has to say because he knows his stuff, and he has a lot of support. Let's assume that the number of people that say follow him on Twitter would be the number of people willing to give him their vote. And then I assume you would probably have a number of quite major influencers, let's say. Because of that concentration of the vote, my concern is that quick, like that oscillation, as you described, is more likely to happen if there is a concentrated vote, as opposed to that majority. Like, is everyone going to log in and change it and be so responsive or be hyper responsive to whatever influences that are around them? But when it's centralized to a smaller number of people, is it possible that could pose a greater threat to this constant pivot of position to a point that it's a disadvantage to the kind of stability that we equally need? I said I'm not answering this to expecting you to have every answer to it, because as you rightly said at the beginning, I think what's the most important thing that Flux is doing is giving people this conversation, is allowing us to think through. These are complex matters. How could that happen? If someone is listening to this conversation, they might immediately think of the response. I mean, you might have it as well, but and that just the fact that we're having that conversation, we're thinking outside the box, and we're trying to progress, for me, gives me all the hope. Whereas 5 years ago, I was at despair. We had Abbott in power. It didn't feel like there was anyone talking about alternative models of how we make decisions. So I asked, not expecting necessarily an answer, but that's one of the concerns I certainly have with that, is could that happen? Could that kind of instability occur?
It's a really good point. And going back to our friend Karl Popper, who I mentioned earlier on, a German political philosopher, he made that point as well, talking about how two-party systems didn't just come about because a group of people sat behind the scenes and said, we're going to construct things in a certain way to make things really difficult for people in 2020 and laugh at them. Now, it came about, there's actually a really rational reason as to why the two-party system ultimately came about. And it really was just about, again, born of the time and the place, people saying, we're going to give you guys, or this group of people, a chance to do the right thing by us for a while. And if you don't do that, we'll replace you by the ones who will do it differently. And the two-party system makes sense in considering the time and place, the sophistication of our societies, all makes perfect sense. And there's something good to it as well, in that, and Popper pointed this out, that it's very difficult to, if we have a difference of opinion on how things should happen. So if, for example, we say, tonight for dinner, I want to have pasta. And you say, oh no, I want to have soup. What is a bad outcome there is actually compromise, where we go, okay, well, we'll just liquefy the pasta and turn it into a soup. And then that way I get my pasta, you get your soup, everyone's happy. And it's like, no, actually, that's not a great outcome, all things considered. And so that's why it makes sense for the two-party system to kind of go, we're going to try one absolute set of ideas for a while, see how they work. No, not working, another set of absolute ideas, as opposed to compromise. And the point that Popper was making was that the more, and it's Arrow's theorem, if I'm not mistaken, that states the more parties you introduce into a decision making, like the more difficult it is to find something that will satisfy all of the people. And it makes perfect sense when you think about it. Of course, the more people you ask what they want for dinner, the more difficult it will be, and we'll just end up throwing everything in the blender and no one will be happy.
Yeah.
So your point stands about the risk associated with having lots of people and the ability for things to change so dynamically. Is there a risk that it would introduce instability? And I would say, absolutely, of course, that risk exists, yes. But again, we have to remember that people we don't necessarily we're incentivized to create good outcomes for ourselves. A system like what we're proposing, where we can delegate to, people who might have influence and whose perception of an issue might change, and it might introduce this dynamicism. All completely true, but we're trying to create good outcomes. All of the people involved in that equation you described are all trying to create good outcomes. We're not trying to create chaos and annoy. Well, yeah, I know.
Maybe the media were in that example.
Well, exactly, and something we need to consider as well is like the role of the media, the role of outside influences on democracies, and we're seeing that play out now. And your points about the role of media is absolutely spot on as well. A free press is a fundamental aspect of a democracy, and we're seeing lots of really interesting trends and phenomena in relation to our press and our media as well. And I would bring an awful lot of the problems that we're experiencing, both in politics and in the media landscape, I bring it back to this concept of incentives all the time. Because when we think about incentives shape the behavior, and at the moment, political systems and political parties are incentivized to get re-elected. That creates the requirement to solicit donations. Those donations are taken in exchange for political favor from the people and the entities,
which then takes away from policy outcomes.
Exactly, and it just so that incentive structure there perverts the outcomes that democracy is trying to achieve. The same way in the media landscape now, when media has undergone such a massive change in the last 20 years with the rise of the internet, and just due to the model that's used to fund the media landscape now, the click-through advertising, that incentive there has distorted media.
Yeah.
Distorted media.
Well, we would need a counter mechanism to disincentivize fallacy and mistruth. And it would need to be, judicially, you need to be prosecuted if you have published or been seen to, obviously different penalties depending on the significance and the severity, but we really need to, as it's not just Australia, as a modern society, take back what truth is. I think we've had a really damaging period where politicians have decided that they can opt in and out of science. You know, like climate change has been predominantly the main part of this, that we can only trust some scientists, and they've really started to damage the what was previously very rarely questioned, the rigors of academics and you know the morals that we inbuilt in, say, peer-reviewed journals and whatever, that started to degrade. And at the same time, we start to see this emergence of people not immunizing their children because of this disbelief. And so the trust between authority and those that are underneath that authority, whether it be listening to scientists or to doctors or to politicians or whomever is in that power, has, I think, consistently eroded. And we've allowed disinformation to be part of that, because we've all got social media and, you know, people that can come out and say, I cured my cancer because I turned into a vegan, or whatever they're saying. And we don't have the judicial system that can keep up with the processing of disinformation and the penalisation of it. And that's a challenge. That's just a really complex challenge in of itself. But, and going back to Flux, and the unique challenges, I sort of feel like going to error correction, for example, what we have now is one vote every 4 years for error correction, right? And that's it. It's clunky. It's like a black and white on off. It doesn't really get us anywhere. I think the concern is on that scale, because we couldn't get clunkier, really, and besides a dictatorship or fascism, right? In terms of the democracy, error correction, very, very clunky, not really particularly useful. But the too far on that scale is what I described before, where we're fluctuating too quickly and there's no stability, because we're going, because whatever mechanisms that we have created are too agile for what we actually need. And I think we would need a solution, and it's not saying it's not Flux's solution, but we would need structure around that to enable us to have the optimum amount of time to test and sort of practices around that, and find that and fine tune, and it will need fine tuning, that balance between we can have a say on this, but once we make a commitment, we need to commit it for X amount of time, or until it's able to achieve X, Y, Z, or it breaks X, Y, Z codes or rules. And almost little mini contracts for each policy that is unique to them. And again, this is very different. I've never thought of any of this. This is coming to my head as we're talking, but anything that we've mentioned in this conversation largely are the conversations that we all should be having, because we need to innovate to improve the way that we make decisions as a country for our future. And we're in an amazing position to do that, but we will need technology. We will need people thinking outside the box and willing to back themselves. But I did want to talk a little bit about the direct vote. So if on Flux, and let's assume in my electorate, a Flux rep is in power, right? So I've got the ideal situation straight through to the top. Let's say we made a vote on repealing marriage equality. I mean, God, I hope that never happens. But let's imagine that did, because all of a sudden the media was spreading a load of disinformation that was in our interest. Is a vote to repeal binding for that representative in Parliament? So let's say if we collectively made what I call a bad decision because of disinformation or fear tactics or whatever it might be, and that rep knows that it's not ideal and probably needs a bit more time to get in front of that communication, is it in your constitution or your intent a binding vote from the people that rep has to enact, or is there some leeway in their interpretation?
Our principle is a Flux representative will act in accordance of the wishes of the constituents that they represent.
Right.
Yeah, as simple as that. And I could talk through your scenario If people want to make bad decisions, that's on them.
Even if it's been manipulated, like even if it's the foundation is mistruth, which we haven't been able to control.
Like, I'll engage with the hypotheticals, this hypothetical for the sake of argument. Yes, absolutely. Because if it is a bad decision, it will create bad outcomes. And if it creates bad outcomes, people are incentivized to correct that and go, oh, we made a mistake, let's do this again. So yes, like the real, like the risk at the core of our philosophy is if everybody lost their mind at the same time and started making, like for some reason decided, as of today, we're all going to start making decisions that are absolutely not in our best interests.
Yeah.
Then our philosophy falls over.
Right.
But we believe that people have, over time, I would say we've got a fair amount of data to work with, that people tend to work to maximize their own well-being and to do things that are in their best interests. So now
it's an interesting point though, their best interests. So let's think then about minorities, right? So for example, because it's topical at the moment with Black Lives Matter, there is an overwhelming number of white people in America that the Black Lives Matter movement doesn't directly affect them, right? And if we are talking about a majority vote for something that's in their best interest, what happens when it is in opposition of the interests of a minority? How's that works out? And is there may not be an answer for that. In the current system, there is, right? There's advocates and there's structure to protect minority interests, and that exists by virtual portfolios. And I assume that kind of process is going to exist, but perhaps it's not, because do we even have portfolios and ministers for various portfolios if there's direct democracy? How do those two words work together?
Yeah. So before I get into that, I'm just going to take us back a step and kind of go, one thing that when we talk about flux and issue-based direct democracy, I have to reinforce to people that this is not something we're going to turn on overnight and all of a sudden our parliament is fully working in this mechanism as we currently understand it today. It will be a slow and incremental process that we build upon bit by bit and kind of rolling out each aspect of what it is we're working on so that we're not dumping the full complexity of our system onto people on day zero and everyone going like, oh, we don't know how to make this work. But, and I just point that out because at a certain point further down the road with Flux, when we've made enough progress in getting involved and participating in the political system, and we have enough engagement in our ecosystem that we are reaching some kind of like local maximum, some like optimized points, and getting a bit of stability and an understanding of what the constituents for this representative or for this group of people want. It's at that point that a feature that's core to our philosophy comes in really useful, and is really kind of it's quite ingenious in a way as a concept, and I'll explain it now in a moment. And it's the concept that's that's listed in the white paper as vote trading. And this is the concept, Charlie, I know you had some reservations about in terms of, I don't know how I feel about this. And when I saw that tweet, I thought to myself, I reckon we've done a bad job in explaining what we mean by vote trading in this sense, because from when you encounter that term, vote trading, you think you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, we'll look after each other, and we'll do some kind of a exchange here, make things work for us to the detriment of other people. And like that's somewhere where the label associated with vote trading isn't doing us a favor. But I try to, when I get onto this conversation, I say, think of vote trading more in an economic and a market sense in terms of our implementation or version of vote trading. It's all about finding out what issues are important to people and what issues are not important to people. So if we bring it to something like Black Lives Matter, that's something, you said that there's an overwhelming number of people, white people, for whom this doesn't matter. Now, I'd challenge that, and I would say that there's a small number of people for whom it doesn't matter, who literally they could not care less, and they go no involvement whatsoever. There's a lot of people for whom all of the social phenomenon around this doesn't necessarily directly impact their lives, but they do have, but they are connected to it, and they would have a feeling and a position on it. And we see, we're seeing that now with the massive protests that are going on. There's loads of, this is where I think that the overwhelming number of people actually is. There's an overwhelming number of people who aren't necessarily impacted, but they are connected, and they do want to voice their connection to this, to bring about something that they believe will be better for the well-being of people in general, but by changing the outcomes for a minority group. So now bringing this back to vote trading and what we're doing, the way vote trading would work for us is for an issue that affects a minority group, assuming that we'll say a minority group says, we want more rights. We want rights A, B, and C. Now, assuming that the majority of people have no issue with those demands, our system of vote trading makes it very easy for minority groups to actually get incremental improvements to legislation passed, because this group of people getting additional rights isn't taking anything away from the majority. The majority will go, yeah, that's fine. It would only be an issue if the majority perceived that something that this minority group was getting was reducing the well-being of the majority group, and they'd say, oh, and then we'd need to correct that. But rights, in terms of bringing it back to fundamental human rights and what things that minority groups want to achieve, I'm of the opinion that the majority of people in society are on board with it. And they're like, absolutely, what can we do to ensure that we bring everybody to what we would deem to be the minimum set of rights that everybody should have, and eliminating discrimination. There will always be, in my view, a very small minority group who will say, no, I don't want any rights for any group that's not my group. But I think that the majority of people would very much get behind a minority group trying to make some sort of incremental improvements, and the vote trading mechanism that we have actually makes stuff like that happen.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, my concern, I guess, is originated in the world since George Floyd's death, and there are too many deaths that ever happened. I mean, and it happens here, right? So we've got some serious issues that we need to work out here in Australia. But using George Floyd as an example, because it's so prominent at the moment, a lot of change needed to happen before it got this bad, right? And my concern is but I think you've answered the question, if it's not seen as pertinent and it's not affecting the majority because it's affecting a minority to an extreme, but it's not getting the news coverage or for whatever, it's not, people a lot stay in their bubble, they're opting out of something that I think is a really important collective conversation because it doesn't impact them, concerns me, because they should be they should be educated. And what you're saying is it's not like they're going to be not educated, but that they would empower those who are disempowered by virtue of trading their vote, as opposed to opting out. I just couldn't get my head around if they could. So like the amount of Women's Day events that I've been to, International Women's Day events, and they're all women, right? And I just keep I refuse to participate anymore, because we ain't going to get the change, especially in corporate Australia, unless the men are part of that conversation, right? Because in this instance, whether it's structurally that way or you know, and I think it is more structurally than or unconscious bias that occurs. If men aren't part of that conversation, we're not going to break through. And the same situation exists, obviously, to a much more complex and more, you know, serious extent to Black Lives Matter. But you have answered that question. I'm trying to process it through my head. It's not that they are given an excuse to opt out and then no longer, I mean, there's going to be some people that do anyway, and we understand that. But as a majority, we probably agree that what will happen is they will hopefully get enough understanding that they can empower others with that vote that actually need it, to perhaps counter that that inequality that exists because of them being a minority.
Yeah, it's like the opt-out aspect is important here, because there's two interpretations of opt-out in terms of what we're talking about. And from a social perspective and a community and real world out there talking about engaging on the issues, you know, opting out can be seen as a disempowering move, you know, almost as in, like, by opting out, you're not supporting the issue. And I think that's kind of what you're framing at around, you know, it would say the lack of visible support by men for the International Women's Day event that you were going to, is kind of, it's associated with you opting out is not supporting this initiative here today. And that makes sense. Like, in a real world where we show our support for things, you know, by I always say, you vote with your feet, vote with your dollars, you know, vote with your votes. And we show our support for things by the events that we turn up, the actions we take, the events we turn up to, where we spend our money. Like, those are real tangible actions. And so to opt out can be seen, you know, I get where you're coming from there. Now, our version of opting out in the issue-based direct democracy sense is really more about getting out of the way of people who want to do things. So for example, bringing it back to, we'll say, International Women's Day, and we'll say me as a man opting out of something that doesn't necessarily affect me directly. Actually, what that does in our system is it creates the space for the group that it is important to, for their issue to take up the space. And I'm not, I can either, use my vote to participate and support or oppose, or I can delegate, or I can just opt out. But me opting out in our marketplace of votes, what that does, it creates, as I said, it creates the space for the person or the group for whom this issue is really important. And this is the sort of dynamic that we need to help minority groups, because, as I said, as long as I don't feel that there is something drastic about what this group is asking for, me creating that space is great. It's like,
yeah, you have the right to take that back, right? Like, if we push it, it's like a favorite sort of perception. Like, if the feminists push it too far and we start legislating things that for whatever reason was deemed unequal or against the interests of the community or for men, then by virtue, when we push it too far, or whomever that minority is, you always have, and that really shows that we'll support you until we can't. And that fluidity, I think, is really interesting. And it's a good leeway so we've seen in what I think is, and I've come across that's a positive way that the trading can help, right? And I hadn't thought of it that way, and it 100% makes sense to me. What about negative? So I brought this up on Twitter as well with you, and I'll bring it up again for the purpose of this conversation. So the NRA have been trying to repeal our gun laws for a very, very long time. And at this stage, it's pretty much political suicide for any of the majors to do anything. The closest the NRA have got to influence is like the occasional right-leaning independent like Qatar. But let's assume then, under the flux system, that the NRA, they're very well funded NRA were to pay me as an Australian to go onto Reddit or in the dark web or whatever and say, I'm willing to pay for your vote on guns, right? So not so much give it to me because I'm an authority and you trust me. Target young men, target disenfranchised people, target whomever the hell I want by offering money. And then I get a much greater influence on a gun vote that perhaps, or almost certainly right now, couldn't have the same amount of penetration or influence. So what sort of mechanisms exist, or how am I wrong in this hypothetical idea?
It's a very interesting scenario there, because like this hypothetical plays to the very problem that we have in our society at the moment, and it's the use of money to influence decision making.
Yeah.
So you're describing a lobby group who say, we want laws to work for us, and we've got money at our disposal. We'll use that money to influence the people who get to make the decisions. And under the Flux system, it's
people,
the citizens of a country, or the constituents of a region, whatever it might be. So I go, right, that's one system. And I'll just for a second frame that against what we currently have, where if I want to get laws passed that are in my interests as a lobby group, I can use my money, but now I just have to reach a political, what political party is in power, or not even which one is in power, which party holds the balance of power. There might be one or two, and we saw in relation to the gun laws, like that story broke in Australia because the NRA were targeting One Nation Party, who in a lot of states and at a federal level often find themselves having a disproportionate influence on things because of the way the numbers stack up, giving them, a sometimes swinging balance of power position. So it's in those situations. So we'll talk about a balance of power situation where there's a contentious issue. What happens under the two different scenarios? So we'll say in one scenario, in the traditional scenario, the balance of power is held by a ideologically driven political party like One Nation, as an example. Could be any party, could be the Greens, it could be any of these kind of like smaller parties. Say. In the other example, and under our system, we'll say the balance of power is held by a Flux representative or a Flux representative and some other independent candidates, or Flux individual, a few Flux representatives and some others. But in the balance of power, there exists representatives who will take their direction from the people of the country. So now this lobby group has two scenarios, and their strategy on how they will influence will vary depending on the scenario. Scenario one party in balance of power. I use my money to either infiltrate that party or to get alignment, get by a meeting, by access to them, say, hey, because you're incentivized to get re-elected, I'll give you lots of money that will help you get re-elected. And when you're elected, you'll help me out by passing or promoting these particular laws in Parliament. You scratch my back, I scratch your back. And given the small number of people potentially involved, it's very easy to set up meetings and go, hey, I'll pay you, 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 and you. It's 7 people I need to pay off inside this political party to make things happen. The alternative, let's go to the scenario where we have Flux representatives in Parliament. If I want to influence how the Flux representative will vote in Parliament, I need to change the minds of all of the people in the Flux ecosystem, in the Flux membership, and in the constituency who participate in telling how the Flux representative to vote. I need to spend money convincing all of them. Now, first of all, there's no guarantee that if a lobby group was to engage in just an advertising campaign, that they would necessarily change enough people's minds. So they go, this is really important. We're actually going to pay people individually. We're going to try and bribe, instead of trying to pay 7 people $1 million each, we'll try and pay $1 million or 1 million people $7 each. Now that's the challenge that they're faced with. Instantly, there's almost overwhelming amount of complexity involved in figuring out how would a lobby group bribe that enough people to actually make it work. And additionally, this is something that we often take for granted. Another fundamental part of our democracy is the phenomenon of secret ballot. The fact that nobody knows who you voted for, and you don't have to tell anybody who you voted for. And the only way that someone could force you to tell you who you voted for would be by extreme physical coercion, where you'd be tortured into telling the truth. Otherwise, there's nothing that can be done about it. There's no, I can say I voted for this person and I may have voted for someone else, and there's no way anyone will ever know. And it's a vital part of a democracy, because it is fundamental to the idea of free elections, the free and fair elections. To have free elections, free choice, you have to have secret ballot. Now, this brings us to the technology aspect of what we've been working on. And a core technological innovation at the heart of our solution is maintaining voter ballot secrecy, even on a digital system, where by using some pretty good algorithms to obfuscate and cloak people's voting patterns, there's no way that I can verify you did or didn't vote as I wanted you to vote. Mm-hmm. We maintain the secret ballot. So even if a lobby group was to say, hey, we're going to pay everyone a certain amount of money to vote the way we want to vote, there's no way that they'd be able to verify how people actually voted, meaning it would make it a very expensive experiment for them to try and...
No, because if I was able how I'd do it, I would, because you have influencers, right? Or experts that are built in to this system. You would advertise, if you were that way inclined, you would advertise and say, every vote you give them, well, so you're saying you can't prove that you've given them that vote. That's fair. No, that's true. You wouldn't be able to then say like a receipt, here's evidence, unless they photographed or screenshotted themselves making that vote perhaps. I mean, evil people have clever ways to come around things. But say, for example, there was a fake expert that was funded by the NRA that was there to collect votes and vote against the interests of Australia and for the NRA. That is something that I sort of theorize as a potential problem, because there's an obvious solution to it too. It means the extension perhaps of governance on big influences. And is that something that Flux has thought through? So for example, declaration of conflict of interest, all of the stuff that we put on political parties right now, and we don't do it particularly well, but let's assume that we did. Where do we start to expect governance and transparency around the influence of the influences under the Flux system?
I'll bring it back to the thing I said earlier of there's nothing you can do to prevent people from making bad decisions.
Yeah.
All you can do is try and set things up so that people are able to learn, be directly connected to the feedback from whatever decision they make, so they decide, did I make a good decision or a bad decision? But if there's nothing you can do to control that, nor is that something Flux doesn't want to get it. Flux is not in the business of telling people what's a good idea or a bad idea. Flux is about creating the space for people to figure that out themselves, essentially. So the issue of influencers or delegates having too much influence inside a system like this, I would say that's very much aligned with an issue that we have today. Where do people get their information from? How are people deciding to choose who it is they'll support on a particular issue?
But yours relates to a direct vote and technically to legislation, whereas in the current system that doesn't, right?
Yes.
So the concern is the influences which exist in society now unchecked, okay, But if those influencers have an extra direct power to influence legislation and no governance. So like otherwise what I see happening is if there is an energy influencer that happens to just exist and by organics builds their following, then energy companies are going to be like, hey, you know what? You're voting out our interests. I'm going to pay you more money than it's, you know, to vote according to us. And therefore, what kind of mechanisms would we have to be able to be more comforted that those that we are, that they might be saying all the right things and they might have one day had integrity, but we didn't actually know that a deal had been done. And that then replicates the same problem we have in this system. To me, it's around the transparency. And if we're having people that are influencers, unchecked, ungoverned, who then have a greater role in legislation or in influence in legislation, that's what terrifies me.
Remember again that these influencers are only empowered as long as they do the right thing by the people who are empowering them. So the scenario that will say that energy companies would, you know, get an energy influencer. Like this is a hypothetical, almost a stretch too far for me, where I don't see how people would be, let's say, duped into following an energy influencer who they think is in their interest and delegating their vote to them, and then for that person to turn around on them, because the people in the, like, they can take away their delegation from this person. The incentive is for if influencers want to gather influence, they have to do the right thing by the people that they're saying that they will be, you know, whose votes they want to delegate to. So the idea that someone would, you know, lead people astray for a while before taking a sharp left turn and kind of going against their wishes, again, the mechanism exists to disempower that person, to take their voting authority away. But if people,
I think that's really important, that they're taking away. But you know where I think of it from? So if you read a peer review journal or even anything on The Conversation, for example, one of the first things that is disclosed is potential conflict of interest, right? Who's paid for this funding? Because it is acknowledged that the power that they have to be an authority is incumbent on them to disclose potential conflict of influences. And that it's that thought process that I then translate here, because they not only would be an authority, they then would have influence in legislation. And so if we expect our academics to disclose conflict of interest, would it not be fair and reasonable that we would do the same for those that have direct influence into legislation?
So with the example of The Conversation, the disclosures there are generally because, you know, I think it's a great idea. It frames the context for people who are reading the articles that are on there, and putting it in context of, okay, well, this person is an expert in this field, but they might be funded by this, that. Okay, I understand now where they're coming from a bit more. And that's useful because the majority of the people you read in The Conversation, you've never heard of them until you read their article in The Conversation.
Right.
But someone that you would delegate to, your voting authority to, should be somebody that over time you have either come to an understanding that either they represent the same worldview or set of values that you espouse. You know, like that's kind of the expectation that, you know, again, we would push onto the user, that if you're going to delegate your vote to somebody, at least make sure that it's somebody who's aligned with what it is you believe. If we create the functionality for somebody to delegate, and they decide to delegate it to somebody who has the exact opposite of their best intentions, you know, at the core of what they stand for, not really much we can do about it. In the same way, if somebody who hates the government goes out on election day and votes for the government back in, you know,
right.
Nothing I can do about that.
Right.
But what you make a good point though, in terms of, like, what is it that we can do? Like, how do we know, like, when we encounter people telling us information or sharing information, How do we get a greater understanding of their motivations and why they're doing this? And I'm of the belief, and this is something that we talk about at Flux as well, is that as we develop these solutions and as we start changing how we interact with legislative processes and informing ourselves, we'll develop, like, other people will come along and develop tools and platforms that will integrate. An example would be like the influencer back check, for example. Someone will come along and develop a website that goes, you can click on an influencer and you can find out where they get all their, like, who advertises with them and so forth.
Right.
And all of these sorts of functions as they're required. There's a great book that I recommend to people that is at the core of how Flux came to be. It's a book by a guy called David Deutsch, a British theoretical physicist known as the father of quantum computing. Brilliant man, and wrote a couple of very interesting books. The second one being The Beginning of Infinity. And in that he said a very short phrase that when I heard it, I was like, yes, that is so true. Explains so much about our world and the way things work. And it is, he said, problems are inevitable, but all problems are solvable, and solutions create new problems.
Yeah.
And the cycle continues.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're doing. Like, we're not going to say that we have all the answers as to how it all should work, and that don't worry about anything. There's nothing that could possibly go wrong. We think that there's currently problems that we can all generally agree on. And we say there's solutions to these problems. But whatever we do, whatever solution we create is going to create more problems from that. And we will solve those. So if we find that our system is starting to really empower influencers where we're not sure as to their motivations, it creates an incentive for someone to create a platform or a solution that all of a sudden will tell you who these people are, do the background check. And right. So I've great belief in human ingenuity and our ability to overcome these, whatever issues and problems come our way. But while I acknowledge all of those problems, I always, what's that expression? Perfection is the enemy of getting things done. Absolutely. Or perfection is the enemy of progress. Yeah. We think that we have enough in our core offering, which we'll be releasing now over the next year, for people to start getting an idea as to how this will work. How will people start engaging with this? And we'll find when we release the first version of our app very shortly, we'll find out all of the ways in which it doesn't work for people. It'll either be too cumbersome or there's too much. But we're going to be releasing it in an iterative, step-by-step release over time so that we can start onboarding people incrementally, building it out slowly and surely, and adding in all of this functionality over time. Because ultimately, like, I've been talking about optimization and incentives all the time. These are words that I use all the time. Our core incentive at Flux, the incentive at the core of our philosophy is about, and there's a word you used earlier, is truth. Mm-hmm. And truth is a dangerous word at the moment, because truth has been taken from the realms of the objective, absolute, universal truth, and now been brought into everybody's micro subjective truth that is in competition with each other. Yeah. But our idea of truth and our system is trying to bring all of those subjective truths and elevate them into an ecosystem where we can start figuring out what actually works. Like, when it comes to truth, there's different interpretations of what it means. But one of the most basic versions for me is truth is what is, like, and what you can. And then how do you establish what is? Well, you try and measure it, you try and describe it, you try and, get a feel for what it is. And I think that we have enough of an ability as a society, as a collective, to figure out when we're making, incremental progress towards orientating towards the truth versus when we're taking like big steps towards, okay, that is completely unfounded, ungrounded, doesn't make any sense. That's not truth. It's not working. Whereas we're always trying to bring the dial back towards what is actually true, what are statements and positions and policies and legislation that is reflective of the desires of people in reality right now. And the shared truth, as much as we can try and measure it, and as that changes over time and evolves, so should the system people use to have those, those aspirations reflected in their society. That system should change as well in line with that. So that's what we're trying to do. We're saying we don't have all the answers, but we do believe we're showing people a pathway and a way to, we think we have an idea worth testing. And the only way that we can find out if what we're talking about actually works or not is to test it.
Yeah.
And so,
and you raise a point that I did want to cover off on. So, and I sort of have already a little bit, but your intention is to almost have a simulation of how it will be in a future tense, right? So what will be really interesting is as adoption, and I would encourage as a social experiment, and anyone that whinges and complains, we need a better system to take part in this social experiment, to see if simultaneously, where if we continue to play the same game we've always been playing, how that differentiates between the outcomes Flux is suggesting the community wants versus what is being presented by our existing system. And I think you and I both probably be comfortable that the Flux system will if adopted relatively at a scale, would be more accurate to certainly that clunky system that we have right now. And the reason, because this is the nuance and the complexity, the reiterativeness that you guys will have to focus as such an important tech, and taking into account there would be, I don't know that it'd be a majority, but probably, of people that are really terrified of change and terrified of doing things differently. And the idea that we will fix it as we go, and and nothing's going to happen suddenly, I'm completely comfortable if not excited about. But I know there is a big percentage of Australian people that won't take that seriously as a political option, because there's too much unknowns and there's too much lack of guarantees, even though the guarantees are a fallacy anyway. It's a myth that who they vote for is what they're going to get. They're comfortable with that myth because they've been used to it. Whereas something like Flux is just too many unknowns. I'm cheeky because I'm bringing it up again. What if the Flux logo, if we think of it much like a Twitter, the Twitter certification, so it's a certified Twitter account. So you have the little blue bird on your profile. What if certain candidates could be endorsed by Flux? So say, for example, I wanted to run. And say, for example, I wanted to run as an independent. And I agreed to whatever social contract you say is a mandatory standard to use Flux, because it was enough for you to create the right change, which is why you're doing a political party. But say I'm not your party because I want to do things slightly differently, and we could come to an agreement and I would be a Flux endorsed because I use that platform. Is that not a way to potentially slowly bring people into the idea of, one, utilizing this technology, and for political discourse to change to be more embrace this kind of technology engagement at a greater level? Because at this stage, if it's Flux with a maybe change, nothing, it's us or not. Whereas if you've got a greater scattering across people, so like Pauline Hanson or One Nation or whatever, you would have in that social contract, if you found that their policies to be abhorrent, by virtue of them not signing the social contract, they're precluded or excluded from being able to use that technology. And you have that power. It's an incredible power with that tech. But I wonder if there's a softer way, there is a softer entry. And I wonder if you guys have even considered that option, or if it's not something, it's a maybe future thought bubble.
So in relation to how we will implement this, what we have to remember, again, we're not going to get a majority of people elected to Parliament all at once. We will get one person elected in one election. We will win our first seat.
Yeah.
And when we win our first seat, the people in that region will get an opportunity to essentially be the first ones to really participate in the most innovative experiment with democracy in the last few hundred years.
Right.
And that will likely happen in Australia in the next couple of years, most likely, hopefully in WA in the next state election, where we will have a Flux candidate, hopefully in West Australian Parliament, who will take direction on their voting from the constituents that they're there to represent. Now, bring aside to the independent candidates aspect of it. So we're all for anybody who wants to subscribe to our way of thinking and empowering people to be involved in political decision making. We're all for it. However, we're of the opinion that for a lot of people, the idea of a direct democracy is something that they'll go, it's like, I care about issue X, issue Y, issue Z, and oh yeah, the direct democracy type stuff, I'd be on board with that as well. But the question that I ask a lot of independent candidates is, we've had independents approaches asking the sort of question that you ask. And I say to them, if the people who elected you, the people that you're there to represent, if they were to give you a direction to vote on something that went against a fundamental value that you hold, what would you do? So in your case, Charlie, if you were running as an independent and there was like a vote that just went against everything you stood for, would you be happy as an independent to vote against to make a vote on an issue that goes against everything you believe simply because it's what the people who put you there said they would?
Because if I didn't, I wouldn't believe in democracy, right? And I take it that it is my, if I was an elected rep, it would be my responsibility to educate and to try to convey my beliefs to the constituency. But if I didn't do a good enough job trying to convince them and they voted against what I wanted, I'm one vote. And that's what's I feel being abused in our political system right now. And so I would vote in that instance, even if it was against my personal interest or completely against how I sort of saw. So universal basic income is a great example. I'm not comfortable with that. I am not dead set against it, but I have more concerns than I have, I'm certainly more concerned than I am excited about the idea. If my constituency were overwhelmingly in support of universal basic income and I had expressed my concerns and it obviously didn't make any difference, then it is my responsibility to pass on the will of the people. Otherwise, it isn't democracy, right?
Yeah, but I'd say, Charlie, that's not an issue you actually care about. It's not like I think an issue that you care about more, it relates to environmental issues. What if you're the elected representative and the people say, we want to open up the country for fracking on a scale that we've never seen before? That's what we want. How do you feel about voting for that?
Same deal. I mean, it would hurt me, and I'd spend so much energy trying to explain so fracking's an interesting one because I don't love it, but it isn't as simple as yes and no. There are so much education that needs to go into it. I myself am not that authority. So if the electorate were, I felt suitably informed and that there was at least enough information available to them, that is my responsibility to provide and synthesize as correct and factual information as I can. And they still voted for fracking. If I was to vote against them, then I don't believe in democracy ultimately, because has to be bigger than the individual. It has to be. Yeah, even if it's a shit decision. that ultimately I would believe is against the best interests of the country, even then, I would not believe in democracy if I was not to pass on that vote. And that is a fundamental flaw of our existing system, because one, we don't even ask them, right? We don't even ask the constituents on an issue basis. That's the most important thing. Or at least the way to do it is so stacked so that it's so outside of a normal person's day-to-day to be able to go and write letters and campaign in the way that you would need to make a difference and have a say. We really don't, the accessibility to have a say doesn't exist, and it doesn't exist in a way that we would need it to really participate in our modern age. And our interpretations of democracy is it's a little bit on the edge because of the fact that we had a plebiscite and not everyone passed it. And I think those foundations have been forgotten. So it would hurt me, but I would take that more as a failure on my behalf, not to educate and not to have a compelling enough argument against it. And if I didn't succeed in that, that's on me.
Yeah, that was a really interesting example because it plays to one of the perceptions that we're trying to manage at Flux at the moment. And that is that one of the reasons why we're not pursuing the independence, like we'll say, trying to onboard issue-orientated independence as a starting point, is because we run the risk of, because Flux is still so unknown and the concept of what we're doing is so unknown, we would run the risk of people associating the values of these particular independents or people who feel strongly on issues with our political party. And so for the time being, we're actually more interested in candidates who are more aligned with serving the role as a conduit. And even the idea of convincing people, like we don't want to get into the business of convincing people what is the right information or the right way to think on things or not. We want to try and just hold open the space as much as possible, examine the role of the first Flux representative, in essence, will be all about making the legislation as it will be voted on in Parliament accessible to people. In just explain to people, this is what the legislation is, this is how it's written. We're not going to tell you what you should think about it or feel about it. We'll tell you what it is. We'll tell you where you can find out, and even the idea of curating information and telling people where they can find out information. It's like, we don't want to bring our bias onto things. And it's inevitable that we will bring the bias if we try that, which is why this is where the role of the delegates is important, where we say, if you want someone who has strong opinions on these things, look to the delegates. Look to people in society who have strong issues on this. The Flux representatives out of the gate are not going to be the sorts of people who are saying, this is what you should think on this issue. And we don't want our representatives to use their, like the position of, like the position in society, or kind of like the platform that they will get by being a Flux representative, to bang the drum for their own issues. The only drum that we want to bang until we make significant progress with this is, we want people involved in decision making. We want people involved in decision making. That's the drum we're banging. We're not going. That's the only thing we'll tell you should do.
Yeah.
And the caveat to it is, we also say you can participate and opt out. We want you to have the ability to participate in decision making. We're not going to force you. We actually our system encourages people to opt out. Back to the thing we were speaking about earlier. We say, when you join our system, opt out, sit back until you understand how it works. Create the space for the people who are interested in having a say on things. And then when you feel ready and want to participate, you're there, you can participate. That's what we want. We want to create that space for people to come, so that enough people in society can start injecting into an ecosystem where we can measure the outcomes, like we can measure what people are voting on, how they're voting on things, and make that transparent. As opposed to us saying, these are the important issues, this is what you should think about, and you can use our voting system to express your preference on that.
So two more questions, and I know it's been a really long chat, and I really
That's
appreciate it.
great.
It's really important, fascinating content. And it's very few people, I think, in the world that I'd be able to have this sort of conversation with. But one of them, if there isn't a majority on your app, like let's say it was 24 million Australians and only 11 ever join. Therefore, I would say there's not a majority. And if there isn't never a full majority, is your direct democracy binding?
You're absolutely right. Like we need to have very clear kind of like protocols and parameters around what constitutes a quorum, what constitutes a majority, and so forth in this system. Now, we talk about this, like you used the example of 22 million Australian, approximately, I think 14 million voters, something like that. What would constitute a majority in that situation? I wouldn't necessarily look at it at that level as much as I bring it back to who are the people that the elected representative is representing. So if you're a senator representing the state of Western Australia, it now brings it down to a smaller number. Then what's the percentage of those people in there that that we'd look to?
So use a percentage then. So like let's say federal Senate. Do you have minimum participation or vote or onboarding that you have that would say, as me as a West Australian senator, well, we've only got 100 people on the platform, so even if whatever vote it comes from the system, I know it's not legally binding because it's not a majority. But when there's an X amount of percentage of the West Australian population that did vote on that issue or have been onboarded, have you guys sort of defined that structure, or when it becomes binding and when it's possibly too little?
Yeah, we haven't encoded that in our constitutions yet, because we're waiting to give people the app, get people using it. But just to throw some figures out there, just as a starting point, at this point in time, when we're a political party that talks about an app, but and we're still to release the technology, we have almost 10,000 members. We've nearly 9,000 members as a registered political party, making us one of the largest political parties in Australia as it currently stands.
Wow.
The other political parties won't tell you how many members they have.
No.
Because you would be, for considering the amount of power and influence that some parties have, the number of members that they actually have doesn't quite line up. There's a bit of a disconnect there. So our starting position is about 10,000 people that will be able to onboard into our ecosystem pretty much straight away. Now, I'm almost certain, and this is I could be proven wrong, but I'm of the opinion that once we release this to people, curiosity is going to bring in thousands more. Thousands, like literally thousands of people will just be going, because we get people saying to us all the time, I thought of this idea myself years ago, but I was never able. And we're like, we all thought of this idea years ago, but none of us were able to do it. We're just lucky that some of us have come together to try and make this happen. And no one person can do something like this on their own. Like, we as an organization at Flux, we're just people who are doing this because we believe it's the right thing to do. We're not getting paid to do this. This is what we believe but we can't do it on our own. Like, if we build this and no one comes, well, then it's useless. But not just useless, it'll have been an interesting experiment. But it all depends on people coming on board and using it. And so we're not going to hamstring ourselves yet with numbers, but we will be having a very thorough and robust, open discussion about how the organization and the movement addresses things like quorums and minimum voting, minimum numbers of people having voted on something for it to count as a legitimate view. Now, just another number to put something in context is polling. Like, Flux has often been compared to a polling organization. And they're like, would you guys consider doing polling? And I say, we're not. Like, we've thought about it. We understand the power that, or the the use of our technology for something like polling. But polling is much easier to do, and that's what other people do. And it has to be, it has to be statistically representative. Like there's, if you're going to do a poll of 1,000 people, you have to ensure, like there's certain categories of demographics that you have to ensure that it is as representative as possible. Whereas because of the way that we're going to be preserving the privacy of the people in our system, we wouldn't be able to segment. We don't want to segment demographics to, be talking about polling. But a valid poll that's used to, influence national narratives is anywhere north of a few hundred people. 1,000 people is considered a really robust poll, and we're saying that we're going to start off with 10,000 plus. And we would expect, I would expect that by the time we have done 3 iterations of our technology, hopefully by the end of this year, that we could have anywhere north of 40,000 people onboarded into our ecosystem.
Wow.
And that is significant.
It sure is. So here's a question. So say I wanted to run as an independent, the opportunity for me to sort of be an official Flux thing isn't there, that's fine. What if, so my electorate is Huslux, so roughly I'd need 46,000 people to first preference votes. It's about 98,000 voters in my electorate. Let's say I get elected and I want to pose questions via Flux to my specific electorate, and all I say to them is, guys, if you want to have a say in my electorate, please log on, download Flux thing. And I have paid as a fee to them so that I'm able to submit 2 or 3 questions directly to you guys a month. Is that something that I could do?
No, that's it's so technically yes, but for us, from an organization perspective, we'd say, like if you're an independent, I would say if you want to interact with the Flux ecosystem, the kind of the starting principle is, you as an elected representative, you do what the constituents tell you. If you want to use our ecosystem for putting your finger on the pulse and so forth, like we're not in the business, we're not in the direct business of trying to facilitate what elected representatives want that's in their best interest. Like we're in the business of representing what's in the best interests of voters and the electorate.
So I have the same beliefs, but what I'm saying is if I as an independent want to use an existing protected secure platform, because if the purpose of Flux is about participation, and I share those views about participation, but I don't want to use a platform that I don't believe is trustworthy and therefore potentially distort or disempower my electorate, I wouldn't be able to use yours to engage my constituency.
It's not that you wouldn't be able to use it to engage your constituency, but it's that we're not necessarily set up to, like, our customer is not the politician. Our customers are the voters. And I don't mean customers, but like we'll say our users, and like just in terms of who we're setting out to serve. It could very much happen that you as an independent candidate, your interests would be served by the very nature of what we're providing for voters, and that you'll get a better understanding of what voters in your constituency might think about issues. But again, we're not in the business of giving politicians a mechanism to poll their constituents. If you were an elected representative, there's much more suitable tools available for you to poll and put your finger on the pulse of your constituents. And
but there, right? Let's explore that idea. Then you're splitting the market. So if I held the position that I wanted to encourage an extra 46,000 individuals in my electorate who had voted for me into your ecosystem, because I acknowledged that it was secure, that it was good, that it gives them a greater access to different questions, but also gave me that facility, I'm adding value to your marketplace by virtue of that. But if I go in and then create my own, or do it in other ways that exist. It could be an email poll, whatever, other Twitter, whatever other mechanisms that I could use, which I probably would use. Then you're splitting the market, you see, because if I'm getting, Edna down the street who's 75 and I'm spending the time to try to explain to her why it's important, I want to hear her voice, and I get her to do whatever my platform is, I feel that it will be even harder for her to then in one day join Flux. And so that's the competing interest. If we all collectively want to have better engagement, if different parties start advocating for different platforms, are we not splitting the market and potentially losing this potential to pull people together?
So I challenge the nomenclature of splitting the market there. Like it's the same people, but the issue you're describing is if we have different platforms, like we're missing out on potential optimizations for integration. Yes, absolutely. But in the same way that we have different social media platforms, different people are attracted to different social media platforms, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that issues aren't being discussed. There's different ecosystems, but there's a way of aggregating information that over time we'll see more sophisticated tools for bringing together information out of different social media platforms. For us, like the point that I'm making is what you're describing, like I've no issue with it conceptually, but it's not like providing a service to a polling service to politicians is not our core mission. If you decide that you will sign up to our philosophy of representing people in Parliament, then yes, like we'll bring you on board. And there is definitely a more nuanced conversation that we will look to have with independent candidates or even other political parties who might come round to our way of thinking. But it's not where we want to go out of the gate, because it's as I said, serving the interests of an elected representative in that way. It's not our core mission. Serving the interests of their constituents, that's our core mission. And if there is alignment between that elected representative and us serving the core mission of the constituents, then there is a conversation to be had. But right now, we still have too much work to do in just demonstrating and doing the proof of concept and demonstrating to people that this is something that they should pay attention to, that we are a party that they can vote for at elections. And we've spent a lot of money and time in just getting ourselves out there and trying to advertise that there is another option available for people. And it's very difficult to communicate. Like even, you're somebody who's who's politically engaged and active in trying to understand what's going on in the Australian political system. And you had encountered Flux before. We've had conversations, and there's still so much that you're just learning today from our conversation. We have so much work to do in demonstrating and, educating and informing people on how our system will work. And so I'm remiss to promise too much about what it is we will do for other political parties or other candidates just yet. I just go, until we serve the mission of demonstrating to voters and constituents that we're a party with a philosophy that they agree with around how we represent them, and the technology solution to back it up. Like that's the only place that's the only place I want the conversation to be right now, because anything beyond that is us writing checks that that we can't cash just yet, and we a level of complexity that doesn't serve us where we are today. But absolutely, it's a conversation further down the line when we have well, let's say, for example, we have 3 Flux representatives in different state parliaments, for example, and now there's an awareness to it. And let's also remember as well, getting elected is really difficult. Getting elected to federal parliament is really difficult as an independent or as a small minor party. At state level, it is still easier, and there are mechanisms which make it easier for smaller parties like ourselves to have a chance of success at state level. And we will be, we've utilized those mechanisms, like the group ticket voting mechanism, which still exists in Western Australia and Victoria. We utilize mechanisms like that where we remain ideologically agnostic in how we assign our preferences. We do it to optimize our chances of success so that we can get elected and serve the core mission, which is doing what the people who put us there, and not just serving the people who put us there. What sets us apart from other political parties is other political parties serve the interests of people who put them there, the voters who support them. We will serve the interests of everybody who we are bound and tasked with serving. So every constituent in our electorate gets a say in influencing our decision. A Labour member doesn't get, the Liberal Party don't go to serve the interests of the members of the Labour Party or the Greens Party. They serve the group of people who put them there. We will serve the group of people who we are elected to represent, which is all of the constituents across the political spectrum and across all demographics. And it's only when we have an opportunity to put that idea to the test and bringing it back to the point, like putting a certain time frame on it. And for us, I believe a great opportunity for us is in Western Australia in the next state election to put in, and the reason I think it's a really good opportunity for us, I mean, for Flux, for people of Western Australia, for anybody who has an idea about, is there a potential we could do this better? And I think the answer is yes. And I think Western Australia is a very fertile ground for it, because as a starting point, you talk about people being resistant to change. Makes perfect sense to be resistant to change. Like, that's a good evolutionary strategy for survival. Don't change things up too much. Work with what you know. In Western Australia, we have a fairly homogenous society. Like, we're all fairly aligned about, how we should be doing things. Like, we're not extremely polarized. And I think that was one of the reasons why Australia and New Zealand were able to respond so well to the recent COVID crisis, is because at a national level, we have a fairly strong sense of what pulling together means. And in our case, it was, okay, everybody needs to stay at home for a few weeks, do work around, people who can work from home. If you can't work from home, we'll try and give as many people money as possible to get everybody sorted. And everyone looked at each other and went, okay, yeah, we can do this. We all have a fairly good idea about what a shared idea of pulling together means. And I think that's even more so in Western Australia, where we're that little bit more isolated from Australia. We have a whole range of issues where there is division on them, and there is some polarization and some contentious issues, which is great. A sign of a healthy society is competition of ideas. But I think that Western Australia is stable enough, and and we're generally aligned enough and generally on the same page enough for us to say, hey, let's elect a Flux representative. Let's use this technology and let's put this idea to the test for one election cycle in WA, which would be 4 years. And if we can't demonstrate in 4 years what it is we set out to do, kick us out and send us to the trash heap. And that's what we should be doing. But if we get voted in, and if we do what it is we set out to do, which is represent the interests of people, as they said, and do it in an open and transparent way, I don't see how there's any going back from that.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, out of just interest though, are you intending to run in the Senate to get the Senate seat, or lower, or both? Where's your play? Because Mark McGowan's very popular here after COVID.
And like I'll give credit to the state governments of Australia in the response to COVID and the approach that was taken. And I wish, yes. So our main focus will be for Upper House in WA Legislative Council, because the Upper House in a bicameral or two-house party system, the Upper House generally serves as the House of Review. The lower house serves as the place where legislation is, and this is generally speaking, legislation can be introduced in upper house, but generally speaking, legislation is introduced and initially debated in lower house. And that's where all of the high profile politicians tend to operate at state level. Like the Premier Mark McGowan is there, the leader of the opposition sits in the lower house. But then the legislation gets passed to the upper house, the Legislative Council, for review. And we believe that that's the ideal starting place for our solution as a mechanism for the voters in society to have a handbrake. And essentially, initially it will be, I think, the initial Flux representative who gets elected to an upper house. For the majority of the time, there will be nothing too contentious that they do, and they'll be most likely, everyone will be telling them, go along with the government. They're doing a fine job. But there will be issues that come along where people want to express, whoa, 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 I think this legislation is bad. Pull the handbrake. I'll express that through the Flux app to my elected representative, and I would want to see them vote against that legislation in Parliament. So our focus on where we would like to see it implemented will be for an upper house seat, because we think that's the optimal place for it. We will also run candidates in lower house seats as a means to, demonstrate that, we're serious. We want to try and serve you, but getting elected at lower house level as well is even more difficult. The two-party system is even more entrenched at the lower house because of the size of our electorates, whereas for the upper house, we have larger regions where we use proportional representation, meaning that you get a greater spread of parties in the upper house, as opposed to in the lower house. You tend to either have winners from one of the two major parties, and sometimes if you have a very charismatic third party or independent candidate, they'll get elected in the lower house. But our focus will be for upper house for the foreseeable future.
Well, as a West Australian, you've got my upper house vote, that's for sure, because I think it's a social experiment. We can't afford not to start trying, right? Like, we can't afford to continue the status quo. And, with as you said, one upper house in the Legislative Council here in WA, it's a great opportunity to stress test the ideas. And a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about in hypotheticals, it's very hard to build cases around hypotheticals, albeit it's where we naturally go when we're trying to get our head around something that is new and we don't understand. And so, which is why I really appreciate the time taken today. It's been a monster of a call, but I think there will be a lot of people that equally be grappling around and trying to get, think through this process. And I hope to think that anyone watching this in full, because I'll probably post it in cut up versions and in full, and certainly those in WA, that they might hopefully take away that it's not something that's going to happen suddenly in formal government, but it is, and it's an opportunity to acknowledge and participate in a way we've never before been able or had been offered to do. And that is an opportunity that we should really take and honor and see. Let's see what happens. Let's see how it reiterates. Let's see what West Australians have to say about a variety of subjects, and hope that in the process of doing so, it actually adds political pressure to those that are in power.
Yeah.
Sorry, go.
Oh yeah, no, I totally agree, Charlie, and I'll be grateful for your support. I know that support is not just one in a moment. It'll be a gradual thing, and as we demonstrate our competence over the next few months and we release the initial versions of the app, and I'll just remind people that this is all a work in progress, and we will iterate, and we will make changes based on feedback. We'll figure out what's working, what's not working. And I'm firmly of the belief that this is an idea whose time has come, and there are so many people out there who are hungry for a way to participate, and even just in that small way of recognizing, I can verify that my position on something is actually heard and is implemented. I understand how this works, and I feel I have agency in my society. I think that it's these sorts of ideas that are pivotal, and especially right now, we're in such an unusual time in the world right now. And, that the interconnected nature of our world means we're getting news from, we're following what's happening all over the world, and we can see that certain countries, their implementation of democracy is, it's creating all sorts of almost insurmountable problems and, ideological impasses where things are now getting really, really stressful and dangerous. And I think I'm referring obviously here to the United States of America, where their version of democracy, what they call democracy, is like, at the moment, their version of democracy gives people a choice in November between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Now, that alone should, to anybody who thinks about choice and having the ability to choose, that's almost comical in how little it represents the core idea of what democracy would be, about having people represented. Joe Biden, one 70-year-old man, another 70-year-old man, and unfortunately, America is the place that we look to for ideas of democracy. America has been the famous exporter of democracy in recent years. And it's just unfortunate that the version of democracy that they share with people it's such a clunky and not fit for purpose piece of software that it's almost crazy that we think that, that we should try what they're doing or pay attention to what they're doing and think that that's something that we should be aspiring to. I could not be further away from that idea. I love the United States of America. I spent a lot of time there. I have a lot of friends there, and it's an amazing country. But right now, their political system is not serving the people. It's been.
So they're almost what not to do. So this is all the mistakes that could be made. Let's be smarter and let's use them as the what not to do Bible, and iterate and be agile enough. And I think if there's ever going to be a country that I believe has the ability to, and I said this in another video, to elevate and to innovate and to come up with a better system and to execute it beautifully or as best we can and keep continuing to improve, it's going to be this one. I have a lot more hope than I do certainly in the UK where a lot of my family are, and I am incredibly grateful for the ability to have grown up here and be having this conversation about Australian politics, because it's possible, right? But what we do need to do is we need to start to have these conversations, to think these thoughts, to support new ideas, and continue to evolve and be committed to improvement, as opposed to despondent and disengaged because of an acceptance of the status quo. That's the cancer that's killing us, is that disengagement because we've given up, because we can't do anything, it's all stuffed. And I think that we need people like yourself, and we need all of those that care about the same things that we've discussed to now be more vocal, to be more inclusive, to help bring and educate more people in that this is a doable thing. Your app is coming out. It's going to be something that people can participate. And I will close it on that. If when the app comes out, then I assume you'll post it on Twitter, but can anyone download it, or is it only for members only?
The initial version that we will be releasing shortly, as an introduction to the sorts of concepts we'll be doing, will be one that we will say is open to everybody, because at that point in time it won't be we'll be initially releasing it to our members, but over time the intention will be to open up our ecosystem to everybody, whether you're a member of our party or not. But for the foreseeable, for in the immediate term, us doing it via our political party and membership system is how we're going to kind of get that initial momentum to make things happen. But once we're elected to Parliament, it will be completely open And yeah, and it's open now. Like at the moment, you can be a member of our political party and a member of another political party as well. Like one of the things that people aren't aware of is that it's actually not against the law to be a member of two political parties. It's often against the internal party constitution rules to be a member of two political parties. And for registration purposes and ensuring that political parties are legitimate, most political parties like to have when they submit their list of members to the electoral commission, you don't want overlap, and like you can't be for that purpose, you can't be a member of two political parties. But point I'm getting at is we are very much an open organization, and we encourage everybody to get involved and initially join as a member, or join our newsletter, or follow our Facebook, and watch what we do, pay attention to what we do, and give us a chance to demonstrate what it is we think we're capable of. Because I echo your sentiments, and this will be the last thing I'll say before I hand it back to you. I echo your sentiments around Australia having a real opportunity to demonstrate to the world there is a better way to do things. Like, we are the lucky country. Now, and it would be remiss of me not to point out that the term "the lucky country," when it was originally coined by Donald Horne in his, I think in his book of the same name, he's like, the quote is, "Australia is a lucky country run mainly by second-rate people who share its luck. It lives on other people's ideas, and although its ordinary people are adaptable, most of its leaders in all fields so lack curiosity about the events that surround them that they are often taken by surprise."
Wow.
So he meant the term "the lucky country" in almost an ironic, sarcastic way, because we do have it so good. And because we have it so good, it's meant that, an awful lot of our leaders haven't really had to try that hard. We haven't had to be as ingenious as possible. And I would say now is the time for us to shed that sarcastic, ironic version of the lucky country, and to actually say, yes, we are the lucky country in so many ways. And we have an opportunity to share our luck, to share the stability that we generally have, and try and demonstrate to people that, we are, and to coin a cliche, like, we are all in this together. We're all on this planet. We're all interconnected now. The internet has opened up the world in ways that would have been unimaginable to people a couple of hundred years ago. We are all interconnected. Ideas are powerful, and there is a responsibility with those of us who have the ability to try and make things better. I think that there is a responsibility to try and help out those who don't have it as good as us. And there are lots of countries in the world who have governments that are like not even close to democratic. And it's on us to demonstrate to those countries that it is possible for people of the world to do things better. And this map shows countries that currently have an electoral democracy, countries that have a say in shaping how their parliaments are formed. And there's still a huge amount of the world who is not even close to sharing ideas and ideals like ours about how our country should run. And at a time when Western democratic institutions, as I said, the headline case being the United States, look like they are failing so badly in what it's setting out to try and do, there really is a responsibility on us to start trying other ideas and better ideas to try and incrementally improve, so that we don't lose all the progress that we're making as a species. Like, because we are all in this together. And I just hope that we can pull together in time to to make meaningful change and to try and make things better. Because ultimately, who knows? Like, we'll see. Watch this space.
It's interesting, and it's a less inspiring quote, and I can't remember the exact phrase, but it's the definition of stupidity when you continue to repeat a behavior and expect a different outcome. And I think that Einstein said it. So it's a quote that share the same sentiments, and I think that to me is a real takeaway. Like if we expect to improve our country and to really realize the potential of that of our fortune, I believe we collectively deserve to be as good as we can be, and we've been mediocre at least of our potential. So it's an exciting idea that we have now opportunities. People like yourself, there are lots of minor parties that I'll be interviewing, each bringing their own ideas and thoughts. But I beg to question, I don't know that there is any political party that's currently in existence that is such a departure from because everything else is still a political party, but Flux is a tech platform. It's a different way of doing things. So, for those that are uncomfortable about change, it's not a all or now we're going to completely take over scenario, but it is an opportunity that I think has to be supported, to reiterate. And like anything, like even in your system, you vote for it once, and in that 4 years, as you said, that you guys aren't delivering to how people expected, they can always take it back in our old system, right? But I think it would be a terrible wasted opportunity if people didn't recognize Flux as that opportunity to start stress testing different ways and utilization of technology to increase engagement and as you very aptly said, agency. It's not something that we've been offered before, and now with technology and certainly with the blockchain that we have. So thank you so much for the chat. It's been a monster of one, but a really important conversations. We can't always get it to 3 word slogans, and nor should we. But hopefully I'll be able to cut it up a little bit into smaller chunks on different topics. So and hopefully one day we'll speak again, perhaps when you've launched the app. It might be a cool thing that we touch base then.
Certainly. And yeah, Charlie, thank you for the opportunity to have the conversation. And you're right, we need more conversations. We need people talking about things, trying out new ideas. And so, bravo, and keep up the great work in, trying to encourage people to start thinking about how they can participate and not just feel like the world's against them. It's about stepping up and doing whatever it is we can in whatever shape and form that takes. So thank you.
No, thanks so much. And yeah, look forward to our next chat. Thanks.